Roll the camera. All right. So let me just talk a little bit about the situation. We're in an economic recession, right? There's confidence in the finances are at an all-time low. Way too much money has been spent on wars in the Middle East. Foreigners are crossing the borders at an increasing rate. And you have an ideological battle going on between progressives and those who want to promote more traditional values. I've just described the Roman Empire in the 3rd century.
I don't believe you.
That's what was going on. That's the situation in the 3rd century. In fact, the economic recession is so bad because the Roman emperors have been promising all these bonuses to the soldiers and haven't been able to pay them, that they've devalued the coins. So instead of having a gold coin that's worth its weight in gold, literally, right? You have a coin where the gold is cut with a less precious metal, but the monetary value remains the same. So how do people react to that? By hoarding the older coins that are really, that have more gold in them, and by switching to forms of bartering instead of using money. So the 3rd century, in the middle of the 3rd century, the city of Rome had just celebrated its 1,000-year anniversary. According to tradition, the traditional date of the founding of Rome is 753 BCE. So 753 BCE, 1,000 years later is, 247 CE. Right? So there's all this enthusiasm for tradition, for traditional values, which of course means paganism, Greco-Roman mythologies, right? And you've got the ongoing wars with the Persians. You've got the barbarians pressing in on every frontier. And a new emperor comes to the throne in the year 249, and his name is Decius. And Decius's platform, if you will, for his vision for his reign as emperor, is all about restoring Rome to its glory days, bringing back the golden age. And that would mean restoring the old religion. So old Decius is up there singing, "Give me that old-time religion." But for him, the old-time religion is the mythologies of the Greco-Roman pantheon. And so to that end, Decius issued an edict. You know what an edict is? It's an imperial pronouncement. He issued an edict mandating that every citizen of the empire, every inhabitant of the empire, must sacrifice to the god Jupiter. Refusal to make the sacrifice would be taken as an act of treason, punishable by death. And this began late in the year 249 CE. This began the first real empire-wide enforced persecution of the church. Why? Because Christians aren't supposed to make sacrifices to the god Jupiter. Now, how did we get here? I want to back up a little bit and just sort of skim over the history of persecution. So I'm going to rewind just a little bit. Some of this we've touched on already, and some of this you either have read or you will read this week. But I want to just sort of back up and show you how we get to this point, because persecution is not new in the middle of the 3rd century, is it? In fact, it goes all the way back to Jesus' crucifixion and to the sort of blackmail that's used to get Pilate to crucify Jesus. What do they say to Pilate? If you don't do this, you are no friend of Caesar. And so it comes down to a choice, Christ or Caesar. And to be for Caesar is to be against Christ. and to be for Christ is to be against Caesar. And it's not a coincidence that Jesus preached something called the kingdom of God, which you could just as easily translate the empire of God, and that was seen as something opposed to the empire of the Romans. And you may also know that, from early on, the emperors started treating themselves as though they were divine. I forgot to turn on my microphone. Started treating themselves as though they were divine. Yeah, there we go. I don't have to use my theater voice now. Think about it. When Julius Caesar was assassinated, the Senate still deified him after his death. And even though they tried to suppress a cult growing up in his honor, it eventually did. And then Caesar's nephew, Octavian, becomes the first emperor, Augustus, and he's adopted, so kind of legally he's Caesar's son in the sense of heir. But think about it, if Caesar's a god, what is Augustus but the son of a god? Right? And again, it's not a coincidence that Jesus is presented in the Gospels as the Son of God, as opposed to the guy in Rome. The next emperor, Tiberius, demanded to be called Dominus in Latin, which means Lord. Again, Jesus is called Lord. By the time you get to the end of the first century and the reign of the Emperor Domitian, and this is the guy who was emperor when the book of Revelation was written. So the number of the beast that refers to a man's name, this is the man. Domitian demanded to be called Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. And what does Thomas call Jesus? My Lord and my God. Right? So, we have this growing sort of competition or dichotomy between Christ and Caesar. Now, question?
What about the Nero?
Yeah, I'm just going to talk about Nero, yeah, that's right. I know I skipped Nero to get to Domitian because I was doing the titles thing, but you're right. We got to go back to Nero because the first real persecution of Christians happens during the reign of Nero. Now, Nero is emperor in the late 50s and early 60s of the first century. So think Book of Acts, right? Nero's the emperor at this time. And in July of the year 64, in fact, it was the 18th of July in the year 64, fire breaks out in Rome and burns down a major section of Rome. And coincidentally or not, Nero has plans on his desk to build a new palace in that exact part of Rome called the Golden House. And people started talking, hey, maybe Nero started the fire to clear land for his new palace. Now, we don't know for sure whether he did or not. It seems likely, but either way, he needed a scapegoat to avoid the blame for the fire. And it's just right at that point that the Christians are starting to be noticed by the Romans as something separate from Judaism. And so the Christians become the scapegoat for the fire of 64. And so Nero persecuted the Christians, but not only because they were Christians. Basically, the way it works is if you admit to being a Christian, you were automatically guilty of arson. And so Nero persecuted the Christians on the charge of arson. And Christians were executed, not in the Colosseum, because the Colosseum wasn't built yet, but in the Circus of Nero, which you know where that is, right? Whereas the Circus of Nero was what's there now. So it was on a little hill called the Vatican Hill, right? St. Peter's Basilica is on that spot, or right next to it. But anyway, but Nero's persecution was very short-lived and localized to Rome itself. But it set a precedent that Christians were seen as somehow antisocial. And so you already know, we've talked about this a little bit, that because the Christians were seen as antisocial, or maybe even holier than thou, in the sense of critical of Roman society, they didn't participate in the games or certain things. because they were they were seen as exclusivistic. They had their one God and they didn't worship any of the others. The Romans actually called the Christians atheists because they only had one God. What's up with that, right? So they were seen as, because the church was evangelistic, they made converts, and because a lot of rumors emerged about Christians, including a misunderstanding of the Eucharist leading to rumors of cannibalism, eat some guy's flesh and blood, right? Things like that. What we have from already in the first century is a sense within Roman culture that Christianity is something subversive, antisocial, and dangerous. And so you'll read in some of your writings bits from the Roman writers like Tacitus, who calls Christianity a destructive superstition, and Suetonius, who calls Christianity a new and mischievous superstition. And so people began to fear the church. The powers of the empire feared the church because they thought it might be subversive, somehow anti-Roman. The general population feared the church because they thought if too many people stop worshiping the Roman gods will stop protecting the empire. And eventually things like even natural disasters get blamed on the Christians because, see, you people aren't worshiping the gods and the gods are mad at us. And so we have these earthquakes or whatever. And even Tertullian complained about that, how every time there's an earthquake or a flood or something, the Christians are thrown to the lions. So we have this growing sense that there's something antisocial about the church. By the time we get to the early 2nd century, in fact, right around the same time that Ignatius of Antioch, he wrote those letters, he was on his way to Rome to be martyred, right? About that same time, there's an exchange of letters between the Emperor Trajan and a governor in the east. Trajan and Pliny, this is Pliny the Younger, in case you're keeping track. Pliny writes to Trajan and says, I'm not quite sure what to do with these Christians in my province. Let me tell you what I do, you tell me if it's right. And he says, you're going to read it. He says, basically we don't, we don't necessarily believe every accusation, but if someone admits to being a Christian, we agree that they deserve to be executed. And basically, Trajan says, yeah, that's about right. Now, what's significant about that, though, is that by the time we get to the early 2nd century here, you see the trajectory from Nero to Trajan is that, in Nero's time, you need a crime. You execute the Christians because they're arsonists, apparently. But by the time of Trajan, you don't need a crime anymore. Christians, it is simply illegal to be a Christian on the basis of being a Christian with no other crime attached. The interesting thing, of course, though, is that you're only convicted of the crime if you confess. And even if you confess and say, well, I've been a Christian up till now, but I'm willing to stop being one, you get to go free. And so, basically, you would be released if you simply renounced the faith. Now, often renouncing the faith, though, would require some sort of proof, like making a sacrifice to one of the pagan gods, or in honor of the emperor. Sometimes, if they really wanted to be sure, they'd ask you to curse Christ. But if you renounce the faith, you go free. If you refuse to renounce the faith, you could be tortured or exiled, condemned to work in the mines until you drop dead, or simply executed. Execution might mean beheading if you're lucky. If you're a Roman citizen and they want to give you the quick and easy death, they'll chop your head off. If not, then it could mean crucifixion, burning, or being thrown to the wild beasts in the arena for the entertainment of the public. So you see what's happening here is that already in the early 2nd century we've got a sense in which it's simply against the law to be a Christian. And throughout the rest of the 2nd century we get these incremental precedence in the law. The Emperor Antoninus Pius instituted a law that made it illegal to convert to Judaism. So Jewish proselytism is illegal. It was still legal to be Jewish, but it's illegal to proselytize. That will be the precedent for a later law making it illegal to convert to Christianity. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius issued an edict where sacrifices were required as a sign of loyalty to the emperor. But he wasn't really trying to persecute the church because he didn't understand that Christians weren't supposed to make these sacrifices. To him, a Christian should be able to sacrifice to Jupiter and to Christ and whoever else. He didn't quite get that. But, during the reigns of Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius, we get some of our most famous early martyrdoms. The martyrdom of Polycarp. Remember, he's the one where he has a vision that his pillow's on fire, and then he knows that, he's going to be burned at the stake, right? Justin Martyr earns his nickname, and some others. And so it's during this time in the 2nd century, and these martyrdoms are recorded, and you know this because I've made you read some of them. These martyrdoms are recorded in the so-called martyr documents, or the martyr acts. And these martyr documents, basically the martyr documents have two parts. There's the record of the trial or the interrogation of the martyr, and some of those might be quite historical. Then there's the story of the martyr's actual death in the arena or whatever it is. Some of those are historical. Others are embellished with some legendary material. And you're going to read the Martyrdom of Perpetua for next week. And next week is the Feast of Perpetua on March 7th. The thing about that is, this is not, an account written later to glorify the martyr. This is from her own diary that she kept while she was in prison waiting to be martyred. So it's a fascinating document. And hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that next week. But basically, by the end of the 2nd century, the church is growing to the point where there are Christians at all levels of Roman society, including, the aristocracy. Christians could be found in all kinds of jobs, including the military. And there are Christians even within the households of some of the emperors. There are, according to, some thought, some of the emperors had girlfriends who were Christians. And so, you have this situation where the church is growing, so it's being seen more and more as a threat to the Romans. At the same time, in 212, the emperor made a law that all inhabitants of the empire are now citizens, so that the expectation of citizens is expanded to everyone within the empire. So if citizens are expected to make sacrifices in the honor of the emperor, that means everybody is. But then, we also lose the right of Roman citizens to a trial by the emperor. Because you may remember from reading the book of Acts that Paul claims to be a Roman citizen, so they have to ship him off to Rome. The same thing happens to Ignatius of Antioch and others. Well, by this time, that's gone. So so many people were martyred out in the provinces without it ever coming to the attention of the emperor. So, you have a situation where some emperors may have encouraged persecution, but even if they didn't, persecution could be going on out in the provinces without the permission or even the knowledge of the emperor. And then in some places, it's dangerous for Christians just to go out in public because an angry mob can form and just rise up and kill a bunch of Christians, and that happened as well. Around the turn of the 3rd century, the emperor was Septimius Severus. Septimius Severus becomes emperor and decides he wants to see his empire. So he travels the east and he comes to Alexandria, where he is confronted with a growing church in Alexandria and a catechetical school that is drawing a lot of people. Some of them are maybe intending to convert to Christianity. Some of them are maybe treating it as a philosophical school and they're there just sort of as inquirers. But the emperor was made aware of this growing, thriving church in Alexandria, and he saw that as a threat. And so in the year 202 CE, he issued an edict that apparently, we don't have the text of the edict anymore, but apparently this is the first imperial edict to specifically mention Christianity. So based on the precedent of Antoninus Pius, this edict made conversion to Christianity illegal and demanded the closing of the catechetical schools. The other thing that we now have an advance on is back in Trajan's day, in the correspondence between Trajan and Pliny, they agreed that there was no need to go seeking out Christians. There was no need to go looking for the Christians. If someone was accused and if they were confronted and they admitted to being a Christian, okay, then they were executed. But they didn't have to go looking for them. But apparently, with Septimius Severus' edict now, they did start going out and looking for the Christians. And this is what ends up happening to Perpetua, because she's with her, apparently with her catechesis class, preparing for baptism, and they were arrested all together. So they were arrested as a group. And so when you read Perpetua's story, you'll see how that comes at a point where Christians now can be sought out and rounded up. And she's martyred in 203, on March 7th. So all that leads up, sorry I had to do that fast, but we got a lot to cover tonight. All that leads up then to, now we're back to the reign of the Emperor Decius, 249. And in late 249, Decius issues his edict demanding that all citizens of the empire make the sacrifice, probably to Jupiter, and in the honor of the emperor. But again, now because citizenship has been extended to all inhabitants of the empire, that means everybody. And anyone who refuses to make the sacrifice could be executed. And on top of that, you had to get a receipt when you made the sacrifice. The receipt was called a libellus, which is just Latin for like little book or pamphlet. But if you imagine a piece of papyrus, like about an 8.5 by 11 sheet, that would be written on, and it would say something like, I, fill in the blank, having always honored the gods, yada, 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 do now today make this sacrifice in the presence of, blah, 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 with these witnesses signed, fold it in quarters, stick it in your toga, right? And you might be asked to produce this, to show proof of good citizenship, that you've made the sacrifice. In fact, you may be required to produce it to sell your wares in the market or to participate in commerce. Sound familiar? Sound like anything from the book of Revelation, right? Okay, so this libellus then was required. Anyone who couldn't produce a libellus, again, could be accused of treason. So, here comes this edict. Everybody's got to make the sacrifice. What do you think the Christians did? Anyone want to take a guess? What? Well, they pretty much lined up and made the sacrifices. Many, many Christians said, whatever, I'll just, cross my fingers and, make the sacrifice. God knows what's in my heart. Now, tuck that in the back of your mind for later, because that's going to be an issue. But others didn't make the sacrifice, but they bribed the Roman official to get the libellus, without making the sacrifice. Or they got their pagan neighbor to go make the sacrifice for them and get the libellus, right? So there are all kinds of scenarios. There were a lot of martyrs, but at this point, a lot of people found a way to try and comply with the law. One of the first martyrs, though, was the Bishop of Rome. And his name was Fabian. And Fabian was martyred in January of 250. And when the Bishop of Rome was martyred, the Roman Church recognized that it couldn't really elect a new bishop right away because it would be very difficult to keep that a secret. So the Church of Rome was officially without a bishop for almost a year and a half, about 14 months. Except that one of the priests filled in as the kind of chair of the Council of Priests, or the acting bishop, someone we've met already, our old friend Novatian. Because he's our foremost theologian in the middle of the 3rd century, right? We talked about that. And by now you should have read some of his stuff. So he became the acting bishop of Rome during the time when there was no bishop of Rome. All right. So many Christians just lined up and made the sacrifices, but others were martyred, and some became confessors. So there were some Christians who refused to make the sacrifice, confronted the Roman officials and said, yes, I am a Christian, and maybe they were tortured, maybe they were thrown in jail, but they lived, at least for a while. And they came to be called the confessors. Remember these guys? They confessed to their faith, even at the risk of their lives, but they lived to tell about it, at least for a while. And what ends up happening, of course, is, again, based on the words of Jesus, don't worry about what you're going to say, because the Holy Spirit will give you the words to say. They're seen as having this charismatic authority, like as if they're prophets. So, even though the church has suppressed the Montanists, here charismatic authority is going to pop up again in the person of the confessors. Now, some of the people who had made the sacrifices later felt guilty about it. But what are you going to do, especially in Rome? What are you going to do? The bishop's dead. Who do you go to? How about the people who are sitting in prison who didn't give in to make the sacrifice? So some of these people who made the sacrifice felt guilty about it and went to the confessors. And so the idea of the confessor sort of morphs from someone who confessed their faith at the risk of their own lives into meaning someone to whom others would go to confess the sin of apostasy or idolatry. Right? And we're seeing here the beginnings of what will become the sacrament of confession. Right? They're confessing to someone else. But in this case, someone who has not apostolic or hierarchical authority, someone who has charismatic authority. All right. In the aftermath of the persecution, you have these different categories that emerge. And let me do this. Okay. So obviously, you probably already know this, but the word martyr is a Greek word that means witness, right? So originally it just means a witness, but it comes to be a technical term here because the martyrs then are the ones who witnessed and then were killed for it. So a martyr is someone who dies as a witness to Christ, right? So you have the martyrs, then you have the confessors. These are the ones who also witness to their faith. They're willing to be a martyr, but they lived, at least for a while. The ones who were neither martyrs nor confessors, the ones who in one way or another gave in to the demands of the authorities, are come to be called the lapsed, because they're seen as having lapsed in their faith. And basically, the idea is that they've denied the faith in one way or another. So the lapsed are those who failed to confess Christ in their moment of decision. Now, but there's different kinds of lapsed. So you have 3 different kinds. There are the apostates. To be an apostate is one who actually made the sacrifice, made the required sacrifice, participated in some pagan ritual, and so they are guilty of idolatry, right? But not everybody did that. There are those who bought a libellus or bribed a Roman official to get, a libellus, or got, a pagan neighbor to go make a sacrifice and give them the libellus. These come to be called, wait, is there two L's? I don't have two L's. All right, libelloteki. There's no good translation for this in English. It's something like libellus getters, or I don't know. But anyway, I guess you could say pamphleteers. But you get the idea. These are the people who got their hands on a libellus to, fictitiously be able to say they made the sacrifice even if they didn't make the sacrifice.
It is a double L.
It is a double L. Thank you. Libelloteki. All right. The third category is traitors. Traitors to the church, in other words. So these are people who maybe didn't make a sacrifice or didn't get a libellus, but they cooperated or collaborated with the Romans in some sense. And usually it would mean that they handed over scriptures to the Roman officials, or they handed over church property, chalices, plates, or whatever, and the Roman officials took liturgical elements in trying to suppress worship. Now, there were some people who, if they figured they could get away with it, when the Romans came to their door and said, hand over your scriptures, they gave them like Webster's Dictionary or something and figured the Romans wouldn't know the difference. And sometimes that worked. But anyway, the traitors were the ones who handed over the scriptures or liturgical elements or something like that. Okay, so we have this problem now. Because the problem is, in case you don't see what's coming, the problem is, what do you do when these folks, the lapsed, want to come back to church? Right? Now, because you've got the martyrs who gave their lives and they're dead, and their relatives are still in the church. And you've got the confessors who maybe went through torture, or who maybe are still in prison, and their relatives are in the church, and now here come the lapsed, and they want to come back to the table. What do? And that's the problem. At this time, the bishop of Carthage in North Africa is Cyprian. And actually, he solved the problem by running. He went into hiding. He headed for the hills and went into hiding during the worst part of the persecution. But he wrote a document called On the Lapsed. What to do about the lapsed. Now, from Cyprian's point of view, remember, he's a bishop, right? So what do you think his primary concern is at this point?
Unity.
Well, absolutely. Unity. Yeah, right? Yeah, right. Cyprian is the guy, by the way, who says, whoever doesn't have the church for a mother cannot hope to have God for a father. So there's this idea where there's no salvation outside the church. The church must be one. It must be one in terms of its discipline. Because the assumption here is the lapsed are excommunicated. They have excommunicated themselves by their act of apostasy or whatever it is. So the lapsed are excommunicated. So the question is, how are they to be reconciled? How are they to be welcomed back to the table? Or are they at all? Should they be welcomed back at all? Cyprian's biggest concern, though, is this: the confessors. Because the confessors, on the basis of their perceived charismatic authority, are granting people reconciliation. So the lapsed are going to the confessors and saying, pouring out their hearts, the grief for having committed idolatry, and the confessors are proclaiming them forgiven. And some of the confessors are even giving them a get back into church note. Some of these notes even say, you and your whole family. So, covering a group of people, most of whom didn't even bother to go and confess. So Cyprian's like freaking out because it's like, this isn't going to work. The bishops have to be the authority over reconciliation. Never mind the fact that he's not there, he's in hiding. But in his document on the lapse, what he says is that the power to forgive and reconcile lies with the church, not with individuals apart from the church. So see what's happening here. It's the hierarchical authority in conflict with the charismatic authority. Jesus gave the power of loosing and binding, right? The power of the keys. This is the power of forgiveness and reconciliation. Jesus gave the power of binding and loosing to Peter and the apostles, who transferred it to their successors, the bishops. So it's the bishops who have authority over reconciliation. This is Cyprian's point. Beyond that, he doesn't want to say too much. At first, he's like, I'm not even sure what to say about this, and he is reluctant to say too much about reconciling, because in his mind, in a lot of people's minds at this time, if you've committed apostasy, this might be the unforgivable sin. And the only way that you can be absolutely sure of being forgiven of apostasy is by becoming a martyr. So while the persecution is still going on, these guys are real reluctant to reconcile anyone, because what they really want is for the apostates, especially for the lapsed in general, to get martyred. Like, in other words, to be confronted again for their faith, and the second time hold fast, confess their faith, and either become confessors or martyrs, because that's really the only way that you could be sure that the sin of apostasy would be forgiven, is by undoing it with martyrdom. Novatian, though, is eventually going to become the one who will be the poster child for the rigorists. The ones who are going to say, no. If we let the lapsed back into the church, it's going to be a slap in the face to the martyrs and the confessors. So we should not. They should not be reconciled at all. So the rigorists in this case are going to be the ones who advocate pretty much permanent excommunication for the lapsed. Now eventually, Cyprian's going to come back to Carthage, and there will be a council, and there's a council in Carthage and then another one in Rome. And basically, they're going to have to work out what to do about the lapsed. And ultimately, the issue is going to be that it's got to be decided on a case-by-case basis, because they can't have one rule that covers everybody. I mean, you've got at least these three different categories, but even within that, you've got different scenarios. So the councils decide, in general, to put it quickly, the councils decide that anyone who is an apostate, who voluntarily sacrificed, anyone who just lined up and made the sacrifice, they're excommunicated. And they probably cannot be reconciled, except maybe like on their deathbed. Anyone who paid someone else to make a sacrifice for them just to get the libellus, that's just as bad, because you've caused somebody else to sin. Maybe it's even worse. But they're excommunicated. Maybe possibly to be reconciled at the end of their lives. If you sacrificed after being tortured, and by the way, there has to be real torture, just the threat of torture is not good enough. But if there was real torture, and then the person finally gave in and sacrificed, they could be reconciled after 7 years. So there's a time of 7 years during which the people are supposed to demonstrate the sincerity of their repentance. Now, maybe you see where this is going. But to demonstrate the sincerity of your repentance, repentance being an inward reality that's difficult to see, right? To demonstrate the sincerity of your repentance ultimately means to do outward acts of penance. So repentance becomes penance, the penance being the outward and visible sign of the inward reality. So if you sacrificed after torture, you were expected to do penance for 7 years before you could be reconciled. Now, except if you were clergy, then again, penance for life, and with possible reconciliation on your deathbed. Now, what's the point here that I want you to see? The point that I want you to see is that the church is by necessity coming out of the persecution, and the persecution is not over yet, but in this instance, coming out of the persecution and creating a certain ecclesiology out of that persecution. The ecclesiology being, what do we believe about the church? And this is the question. What is the church? Is the church a community of saints? Or is the church a school for sinners? Is the church a clean room? You know what a clean room is, where you got to wear the whole white suit and all that. Or is the church a hospital? Is the church a country club for the perfected? Or is the church, a hospital for those who need healing? Right? What is the church? Is it an enclave of people who want to keep themselves pure because they're pure and they don't want to have anything impure? Or is the church a place where the impure can become more pure? You see the difference? If you're a Novatian and the rigorists, then the church is this clean room. It's the community of saints, the enclave of the perfected. And you don't want the imperfect in there, because the imperfect will somehow taint the perfect. Now, all of this comes to a decision point when the Roman Church is finally able to elect a new bishop. Because by all rights, Novatian should be the next bishop. He wrote, basically the defining document of orthodoxy for the mid-3rd century. He's the acting bishop of Rome and the chair of the Council of Priests. Now it's election time. It should be a no-brainer. Guess what? He loses. Another guy is elected instead, a guy named Cornelius. Why? Because Cornelius is a pastor. The theologian is the rigorist. The pastor is the one who recognizes that, we can't just kick out all the lapsed. First of all, that's going to decimate the church. But secondly, what does that say that on some level that says something about what you believe about the church. And so Novatian, while he as good a theologian as he was, his ecclesiology went down this road of rigorism, and ultimately he gets himself consecrated as a rival bishop of Rome against Cornelius, and becomes really the church's first real schism, where the church splits. He starts his own movement, and it's very telling that, of course, they're called Novatianists, but in the East, in Greek, they're called the Katharoi, the purists, or the pure ones, right? So that tells you exactly what they think. Yeah, very good. It tells you exactly what they think the church is. It's a place for the pure, where we don't want to include anyone who's not pure. There's a basic issue here. Do you believe that impurity taints purity, or do you believe that purity will rub off on impurity, making it more pure? You know what I mean? What's more powerful, purity or impurity? Right? The rigorists are worried that the impure will taint their pure church, and so it's exclusive. You exclude the impure. The mainstream church is going to go a different way. The mainstream church is going to say, no, the church is a school for sinners. It's a hospital for the sick of soul. It's the place where people get healing. It's not a place where you kick out everybody who needs healing. So the church is going to be inclusive. And so the mainstream church then is represented by Cornelius in Rome. Now, Cyprian is going to be more mainstream, but again, he's concerned about who has the authority to reconcile. He's concerned about, in some ways, about the unity of the church, because we want to control who we let back in. We're not excluding everyone, but at the same time, we're not going to the other extreme and including everyone either. We're going to control who we let back in and under what process. And we're going to control who has authority over that, who has authority over reconciliation. Now, the question will then come up over time. Well, what happens if someone is converted to Christianity from paganism by the Novatianists? The Novatianists convert somebody, they join this movement and get baptized by these guys. And then they realize, wait a second, you guys aren't the mainstream church, you guys are just this little faction. I want to be in the big church. So then they want to come over to the main church. Now, a couple of things I'll have to back up in a second. But the question is going to be, do they need to be baptized again? They were baptized by the Novatianists. Does the person need to be baptized again to come into the mainstream church? And here's where we have to start using the C word, the Catholic Church, right? Because with the Novatianists, by the way, we haven't gotten to the Council of Nicaea yet, but when the Novatianists go to the Council of Nicaea, they're declared Orthodox, which ultimately means that the church is going to recognize that it's possible to be Christian and not Catholic. So for the first time with the Novatianists, we have this sense of something like a modern denomination almost, like that there will eventually be an acknowledgement that it's possible to be Christian and yet be in a separated ecclesial body. Now, not at first, and most of Novatians' enemies will call them heretics, even though theologically they're not heretics. In that sense, they're kind of like the Montanists. They're rigorists, but not really heretics. But the Novatianist church will spread and last for a couple of centuries, and longer in the East than in the West. But when people want to, rejoin the Catholic Church, and I'm using Catholic with a small c, but in a sense, it sort of has the meaning of it's coming to have the meaning that it has now. So Cyprian responds to this by saying that if you're baptized, the person who performed your baptism has to be within the Orthodox Church, or the baptism is not valid. So Cyprian starts rebaptizing people who come into the Catholic Church from the Novatianists or any other movement. Now, by now, the Bishop of Rome is no longer Cornelius. I'm losing all my erasers and everything here. By now, the Bishop of Rome is a guy named Stephen. And Stephen and Cyprian are now going to butt heads. So it's interesting because when it's Novatian and Cyprian, Cyprian represents more closer to the mainstream. When it's Stephen versus Cyprian, Cyprian will not necessarily represent the mainstream. Stephen is Bishop of Rome. And what I want you to see here is how the persecution brought on the controversy over reconciliation, and that will necessarily bring on the controversy over baptism. Because the question is going to become, the question is this: for a baptism to be valid, does the presider who administered the baptism have to be Orthodox, not a sinner, whatever, right? In other words, does the presider over the baptism matter to the validity of the baptism? And in a sense, by rebaptizing, Cyprian is saying it does matter. So if you were baptized by a Novatianist or whatever, and you want to come into the mainstream or the Catholic Church, you would need to be rebaptized. Now, Stephen gets wind of this. He's Bishop of Rome from 254 to 257. Stephen gets wind of this, that Cyprian is rebaptizing, and he says, wait a minute, Cyprian, stop doing that. Novatianists do not need to be rebaptized, because it doesn't matter whether the presider who administered a baptism is schismatic or not, or even a heretic or not. Because ultimately it's God who does the baptizing, not a human being. And so if we believe God is faithful, then the baptism is valid no matter who did it. Now, this is going to be, kind of a conflict between Stephen and Cyprian, because Cyprian, he might theoretically agree that everybody should agree with the Church of Rome on doctrinal issues, but he does not want to submit to the authority of the Bishop of Rome. And so the question is going to be, what makes a valid baptism? And first Stephen says, as long as a person's baptized into Christ, it's a valid baptism. But then his opponents press him on that and say, well, wait a minute, which Christ? What if Marcion baptized somebody into the docetic Christ? And then Stephen kind of backpedals a little bit. He says, okay, well, I'll give you that. Okay, as long as the baptism is done in the name of the Trinity, then it's valid. And that becomes the official position of the church. That a baptism, as long as it's done in the name of the Trinity, is valid. And in fact, in many churches, Roman Catholic included, to this day, technically speaking, especially in an emergency, anyone can do a baptism. If a Buddhist comes along and baptizes someone in the name of the Trinity, and if they intend to do what the church does when it baptizes, that's the language, that baptism is valid. Right? So a person doesn't even have to be, not only do they not have to be clergy, they don't even have to be Christian to effect a valid baptism, because it's God who does the baptism. But notice the two different ways of looking at the church here. Again, for Stephen, and the way I talk about this, he has a Roman view of baptism. That becomes the official view. But in the Roman view of baptism, God does the baptizing. It's God who affects the validity of the sacrament. So the faith or orthodoxy of the presider doesn't matter. Now look, this is important. Here's the so what moment for tonight. What if this is not just relevant to the Catholic Church, this could be relevant to any church, but what if you found out that the guy who baptized you later turned out to be a pedophile or have done some horrible stuff?
That's my story.
Okay, well, I wasn't trying to get too personal, but it's important because, does that invalidate your baptism? And the church says, no, it does not. The faith or, purity or whatever of the presider doesn't affect the validity of the baptism, because it's God who does the baptism. Now, Cyprian, though, who has this, what I call a North African view of baptism, is saying that it does matter. That, in a way, with the North African view of baptism, the grace is kind of like coming through the conduit of the presider, like as if grace flows from God through the presider to the recipient. And if the presider is a king toes, it's going to stop that flow of grace. And so the North African view of baptism, and in fact the sacraments in general, sort of has this assumption that if the presider is unfaithful or a heretic or whatever, that the sacraments are invalid. And ultimately, the Roman Church, Stephen, and then what becomes the official view of the church, says no, it doesn't work that way, because God is faithful. And so it doesn't matter if you were baptized by a schismatic like Novatian, as long as the baptism is done in the name of the Trinity, the baptism is valid. But again, this tells you sort of how they view the church and its relationship to the Holy Spirit, for example. For Cyprian, again, the Holy Spirit sort of passes through the presider. Could be the same thing with ordination later, as ordination becomes a sacrament, right? We're going to see this when we get to the 4th century in the conflict between Augustine and the Donatists. We're going to see this. What happens if you find out your bishop was consecrated by another bishop who lapsed during the last persecution? Is your bishop not a valid bishop? That issue will come up. So this question with the sacraments is whether the presider is a conduit of grace that can block grace, or whether grace doesn't flow through the presider, but directly from God to the recipient. So the Roman view becomes the official view, that sacraments are... By the way, in fact, the word sacrament in Latin, sacramentum, simply means mystery. If you want to translate it sacred mystery or holy mystery or something like that, that's fine. But it really just means a mystery. So the sacraments are the mysteries of the church. Why are they mysteries? Because God is at work. And it's not a magic trick, and it's not simply, some person who is, making a transaction where, I'm going to get some grace and give it to you. It's, but you need me to give it to you. It's not quite like that. So it's interesting that, the mainstream church, for all of its emphasis on a hierarchical authority and an apostolic authority and apostolic succession, yet when the rubber meets the road with the sacraments, what makes it valid is simply, that it's done correctly. So, it's possible to have an invalid baptism by not baptizing in the name of the Trinity, but assuming it's done correctly, it doesn't, it doesn't matter who did it. Another thing that we're seeing here in baptism, just to point this out, is that especially in Rome, we're beginning to see this is where baptism and confirmation start to become separate rites. Remember, I told you at the beginning that baptism and confirmation were one thing. But the more you baptize infants, which they absolutely were doing, the more you baptize infants, the more you have to postpone the confirmation until later. All right. Well, let me stop there and see if there are questions or discussion based on the controversies over reconciliation or baptism. Is that a question back there? Yeah.
The Apostolic Tradition, how does that relate to what we're talking about now?
Are you talking about the document, the Apostolic?
Well, yeah. Well, basically what I'm thinking about is that listing of occupations.
Yeah.
They had to be aware of when they were seeking members.
Yeah.
And I wondered, it's sounding a lot like that document in the sense that you say, okay, this is a list of occupations you have to be wary of. If you're a magician, oh my God, no, you're not even going to be part of it.
Yeah, right. There were certain things that you couldn't do for a living. But again, the very fact that somebody felt the need to make that list meant that there were probably musicians. Yeah, I'm a musician. You're not supposed to be a musician. No. That there were magicians who were, wanting to join the church or whatever, and so it was an issue. With these documents, like the Apostolic Tradition, and there are others, I referred to them earlier as the church order documents. For the most part, Apostolic Tradition is a good example. It's traditionally attributed to Hippolytus. And maybe Hippolytus wrote a document called the Apostolic Tradition. But the document that we have now has all kinds of layers added to it. So when you read these documents, you can't pin them down to one point in the church's history. In fact, what scholars are doing now is they're looking at the document saying, oh, this chunk is from early, and this chunk is from late, and you're looking for the layers. But these are documents, and what ends up happening is somebody writes a church order document, say this is how we should do things, but as that document gets copied and passed down, they add to it, and they embellish on it. Oh, well, this is what we do now, so I'll throw that in there. And so the documents as we have them now are not in the form that they were in originally. So when you read those documents, you're really looking at, 4th century stuff in there too. So a lot of that stuff is coming later. Especially when you get into the ones that talk about how ordination is done, because you look at how they would do their rite or their rituals of ordination, and it's clear that it's post-Constantinian, because there are elements in there that look like the rituals from crowning a king and stuff like that. So there's all this sort of embellishment that comes in. Yeah. What else? Questions, comments at this point? No? Okay. Well, let me come full circle then and just talk a little bit about the end of the persecution, and I'll be done in maybe 5 minutes or so. Yeah, go ahead. That's right.
Back when I mentioned Nero, I meant like the 666. I thought that was supposedly Nero.
Oh yeah, no, it's not. Some books say that, but it's not, because Nero's persecution was too short and too limited to the city of Rome to have been the impetus for the book of Revelation. So I date, and I think most people date the book of Revelation to the reign of Domitian in about the year 95. Yeah. And in fact, the number 666 is one of those things that you could make it anybody's name almost. I mean, I've seen people do the math on that and say, oh look, Ronald Reagan. And I mean, so you can make it say almost anybody. But the one that fits the best with the imperial titles and all that would have been Domitian. Yeah. So it's, to me, that it's clearly, when that's written in the text, when John writes that, that's a reference to the current emperor at the time the book was written. So, yeah.
Under Decius, were there people who were converting to Christianity under his empire, people that were working directly for him, and were they letting these people into the church if they decided to?
Well, I don't know of anyone particular in Decius's own household who was Christian. There may have been. But certainly there would have been people converting all the time, even within the upper classes. The more time goes on, the more we see people in the upper classes, even in the senatorial class, converting. But then, in the highest socioeconomic classes, it's going to be mostly women, because the men are still trying to pursue an upwardly mobile career in the Roman, government, and so that would conflict with the expectations of being baptized Christian. So it'd be mostly women. But yeah, I mean, it's happening all the way through this. When we get to the so-called Great Persecution of the early 4th century, we'll see how the wives of a couple of the emperors may have been Christian. So, anything else? Okay, all right, just a little bit of wrap-up then. All right, so as I said, the Roman way of looking at the sacraments and at the church will become the official point of view of the church, and will sort of win out over the North African way, except that, again, when we get to Augustine and we look at his conflict with the Donatists, that was all taking place in North Africa, but Augustine represents the Roman outlook, and the Donatists are the North Africans. So we'll see that when we get there. All right, so Decius's persecution didn't last all that long, because after a couple of years, he's killed in battle. Eventually, the Emperor Valerian comes to the throne. Valerian becomes emperor in 253, and in 257 he renews the persecution. And so, again, thinking that the church is getting too powerful, too wealthy, penetrating too far into the upper classes. And so Valerian's persecution targeted specifically church leaders, teachers, evangelists, clergy. And so it was in 258, both the duly elected Bishop of Rome, Cornelius, and Novatian, his rival, were martyred. And so, it's one of these situations, and we saw it with Hippolytus too, where there are these rivals within the church, but they end up sort of dying side by side, as martyrs. But anyway, Valerian issued 2 edicts in 257 and 258, and again, targeting the church leaders, all bishops required to make the sacrifice, Christian assembly outlawed on pain of death, and then in 258 he must have decided, what am I messing around for? All clergy are condemned to death, and so he actually was captured in battle in 260, and his son became the next emperor, and his son decided to ease up on the persecution and basically restore the church to its former status before Decius, which is not exactly legal but tolerated. So after 260, I'm almost done, I swear. After 260, the church is able to relax. Persecution is over. And people think persecution is over for good. Now, in 40 years it's coming back, and the church will get complacent in that 40 years. But it's within that 40-year span, when Christianity is not legal yet, but the persecution is eased up, it's within that 40-year span of time that the church begins to own property as a corporate entity. And the church goes from simply worshiping in homes to modifying homes, to remodel homes so that they're specifically used for worship. So we start to have designated worship space where maybe some wealthy person will donate a home or an apartment space that will be gutted and remodeled and used only for worship. And maybe a baptistry added onto it. And so we start to get, we're not getting buildings built specifically as churches yet, but that's coming. But we're getting to the point now where there is designated worship space. So it's within this time that the church, that, maybe now you could walk down the street and see a church, although it wouldn't look like anything because it, was originally built for some other purpose. But eventually, by the turn of the 4th century, it's going to get to the point where the emperor in the East can look out his window and see the church. And he's not going to like it. So that's coming next week. Now, questions or comments at this point? No? Everybody tired? Yeah, me too. Last chance. I know nobody wants to be that person who asks the question. Everyone wants to go home, but I'll give you one more chance. Tickety-tock. Okay, good. Well, then we'll see you next Monday for the Feast of Perpetua. And if you want to bring food to share, you're welcome. It's not an obligation, but you're welcome to do that. So we'll see you then.